have what I usually do is have quite a few rather dense slides. You do not have to read everything in every slide. I will talk you through the important bits of each slide and you can have them afterwards and catch up with them if you want to. We may not get through all the slides, but you can have them afterwards. So, great, really pleased to be with you, as I say. So now I'm going to start by briefly looking through some of the core aspects of the framework, and I'll do this, I hope, by sharing my slides. I'm not very good at technology, but luckily Kim's here to help. So share screen. And I think, yeah. Excellent. I think that's working. Yeah. I'll assume things are working unless someone tells me they aren't.
Yeah, that's fine, Lucy.
Excellent, thank you. So the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a very, very ambitious document that was published in January 2018. The top group of people, the group you can see there are the authors. I and Mary Boyle are the lead authors. It was produced by mainly psychologists in collaboration with survivors, Jackie Dillon and Eleanor Longdon, who you may have come across, who are people who would see themselves as having escaped and survived the psychiatric system. And it's published by the British Psychological Society, but it's not a formal BPS document. It's optional, nobody has to read it, like it, agree with it, or do anything with it, but nevertheless, I'm going to show you that it has attracted a much wider audience than we ever hoped for, which is great. And just to, right, hope I can get the next slide here. Just to summarize very briefly what it's about moving away from what Mary Boyle has called the DSM mindset, the whole idea that various forms of distress, emotional and psychological distress, are best understood as kinds of medical illnesses. Now, this has been a theme of my whole career, really. I've never believed in the diagnostic model of distress. And it's also been a theme of the careers and lives and experiences of the people who put together the framework. So for a very long time, we have all been arguing that we cannot understand what goes wrong in our lives in the same way as we understand what goes wrong in our bodies. So our alternative is the framework, which is it's a set of ideas. It's not a manual for do it like this, do it like that. It's a set of ideas which we wanted to publish to see if anyone was interested in translating into practice and evaluating it sort of on the ground in the settings you're familiar with, if you like. And it's based around core questions, which I think you may have been introduced to, and these questions can provide a structure for putting together narratives or stories or formulations about people's lives. Not just about services, but about, the framework is about all of us, people who are in services, people who are in voluntary settings, and indeed all of us. So very simply put, the framework says that narratives of all kinds can be an alternative to psychiatric diagnosis. Right, my slides don't seem to be moving very easily. Next. So the core aims are about recognising that distress is understandable in circumstances, to make links between wider circumstances of people's lives, links between distress and social injustice, increase people's access to power and resources, create validating narratives, and promote social action. It's really not just about individual people and what might help for them, it's about wider social contexts. And as I've just said, it's very much based on the idea that we all have a natural capacity to make stories and meanings about our lives. We can do that in all sorts of ways. And although psychologists have a particular way of doing that, which we call formulation, there are many equally valid ways of creating narratives and stories about our lives through art, poetry, music, and so on. And because of this very broad definition of narrative, it makes the framework, we hope, compatible with some non-Western understandings of distress, which don't use diagnostic models, but are very often based on particular forms of beliefs and stories and legends that are meaningful within particular cultures. From a framework point of view, that is absolutely fine. If it makes sense in your context, it can be a valid way of expressing, experiencing, and healing distress. So The framework, I should also say, isn't about stopping everything we're doing and doing this instead, because it very much supports and adds extra evidence, we hope, for a number of non-diagnostic ways that we already have about thinking about and healing distress in people's lives. I'm going to whiz through these slides very briefly just to give you some sense of the way that the framework's been taken up. We've done a lot of talks. I've travelled to New Zealand and Australia, a number of other places. It's the most popular publication in the BPS's history, which is interesting. And I think this does suggest that there are a number of people saying the way we currently have of understanding distress is not good enough, needs to change. These are links if you want them, an edition of Clinical Psychology Forum that has examples of using the framework in practice, and an edition of another journal that's entirely devoted to the framework, articles in various other places. As I said, I'm whizzing through this fairly quickly, but this is a number of examples from quite small ones to more ambitious ones of introducing the framework principles. I may have time to talk to you about the inpatient wards in London, which have done a pilot study, which is being rolled out across that particular trust. But other ways of taking on the ideas are much kind of smaller and may involve simply adding some additional thoughts or ideas to your current practice. It's being taught, at least to an extent, on most clinical psychology courses on the UK. Of course, that might be just a session, but at least it seems to be quite widely recognised as an approach. There are a number of translations that are either have happened or are on the way, which is great. The latest one is Korean, which should be interesting. And it's appearing in some textbooks. So it's achieving quite wide recognition, or of course it's still very far from the dominant approach. And we have a committee which is set up to take the PTM ideas forward. I'd strongly recommend you visiting that website because that's all got all the documents, resources. It's being updated regularly with examples of how the framework's being put into practice. Okay, so these are the core questions, which I think you are familiar with. They are based on expanding a common survivor slogan, which is, instead of asking what's wrong with me, ask what's happened to me. And that is the essence of the framework in a way. Instead of try to work out what kind of illness or disorder I've got, let's think about what's gone wrong in my life or our lives. So those are the core questions which I'm going to kind of whiz you through. And these are the other two questions that are important. And when we do the exercise, we're going to think about these questions in relation to a particular person. And it's important to say that these questions don't have to be asked in those words, in that order, in exactly that way. These indicate areas to explore, and you might want to start at a different end. You might want to start with strengths. You might want to use different language. You would probably need to go back over these questions because they're all interrelated. They suggest areas we need to think about. And the questions are overlapping. If you think about power, you're automatically thinking about threat. If you think about threat, you're automatically also thinking about meaning. So they're different perspectives on the same experiences, if you like, but they are evidence-based questions in the sense that the framework has amassed a huge amount of evidence that suggests very strongly these are the areas we must look at in understanding people's distress. And these are the questions which will help us put together a narrative about the reasons for distress in people's lives. Okay, so I'm going to start with power. We put power up front there because power, a consideration of power in all its forms, it's what's by definition missing from psychiatric diagnosis and missing also from a lot of psychology and psychotherapy, we said. So we're not just critical of standard psychiatric practice, we're also fairly critical of quite a lot of standard psychological and psychotherapeutic practice, to the extent that they tend to locate the problem in the individual. It's your chemical imbalance or it's your negative cognitions. It's saying much the same kind of thing, actually. The problem lies somehow within you and you need to adjust yourself. Whereas the framework perspective is very much the problem lies in the kind of lives that people have to live and the ways in which, for very understandable reasons, they may not find that comfortable or easy. So power is the most important question, as I said, and you don't need to read all this teeny tiny writing, but we very much wanted to think about power in all its aspects. So as psychologists, we are, or we will become used to thinking, for example, about interpersonal power at the bottom, the various ways people can hurt or abuse or neglect each other, and how that affects people's, what we call mental health, which is not a term that the framework would use. But we also wanted to think about the many other ways that power operates in people's lives, which we often don't give enough consideration to. Do they have enough to eat? You know, are they subjected to various forms of legal power, and how does that affect them? And these forms of power, including social and cultural capital, the more subtle forms of power or lack of power that arise through your kind of your background, your education abilities, your class background, and so on, and which are very much eroded by giving someone a diagnosis, which automatically excludes people from access to certain forms of power and resources in their lives. And we particularly wanted to think about ideological power, power of language, control of language, meaning and perspective. This is not a very obvious form of power, but it really is about the ways we are encouraged to think about ourselves and our worlds. And we're often encouraged to do this by the use of certain forms of language. And we are encouraged to accept certain ways of how we should be, how the world should be, as normal and natural. So we are encouraged, for example, to accept certain standards about what it is to be a good mother or successful or a happy family or whatever. And we're encouraged to hold stereotypes about certain groups in society. And it's easy to look back and be horrified at some of the stereotypes we have, you know, at various points in our history been encouraged to believe. Women are less able to do certain jobs than men and so on. Psychology has a very shameful history of promoting the idea that some ethnic groups are less intelligent than others. But the trick is to see, I think, how these stereotypes still exist and in whose interest they operate, because very often these stereotypes, these social norms and expectations and the language we use operate in the interests of people who are already more powerful and to the disadvantage of people who are much less powerful. So I'm afraid there's a lot of examples of that around at the moment. I mean, whose interest is Brexit operating in? How were we encouraged to vote for it if we did? Austerity measures, language like welfare scroungers for people who haven't got jobs, in wealth creators for people who are making a great deal of money out of austerity measures as inequality increases. All of these language uses can be seen as examples of ideological power, which operate in people's lives in ways that aren't always very visible. And from the point of view of the framework, the imposition of psychiatric diagnosis and the whole set of beliefs that make up dominant psychiatric models are examples of ideological power. They are examples of giving people who are almost by definition already more vulnerable, already more disadvantaged, a label, an identity backed up by all sorts of language uses, which further disempowers and often re-traumatizes them. And while some people find a diagnosis helpful and it has some advantages and benefits, and at a practical level, we recognize in the framework, we recognize people need their diagnoses for some purposes. At another level, it's the imposition of a very damaging form of identity. And of course, we have all sorts of language and assumptions about mental illness, chemical imbalance theories, and so on, which are actually not backed up by evidence. And I think we think it's important to say in whose interests might all this be operating. So, and of course, we're not saying that power is all bad. Power has, power is neutral, and we're all interested in the professions we're training for because we want to use our power in a beneficial way. But to do that, we need to be very aware of the disadvantages and the way, perhaps without meaning it, we may become part of imposing forms of power that are ultimately not helpful to people. Okay, so the next question is, what threats did it pose to you? So the framework has a list of core needs that we all ideally have met as human beings, though few of us are going to be able to tick all those boxes, but generally these are the kind of things that we need in order to survive and flourish as individuals, as families, as communities. And the negative use of power can form a threat to any one or perhaps many of those different core needs, including the more subtle ones: to feel we live in a just and fair society, to have connections to the natural world, to have a sense of hope, meaning and purpose in our lives. So the second question encourages us to think about the many ways in which the operation of power can pose threats to us. And again, we're used to thinking about this in some ways. We're, yes, less used to thinking about it in other ways. The very damaging impact, for example, of feeling excluded from a community, from not being part of a social group. The very damaging effects of actually not being able to live a life that feels to you in line with your beliefs and principles and feels meaningful and worthwhile. Those are the more subtle forms of abuse of power. And to spell it out a bit, we've given lots of examples in the framework, so we really need to think from the point of view of the person what it is like to experience some of these threats. So poverty, here's someone saying how incredibly stressful it is to be lacking even £3 or £4 when you have very little money. Job loss, here's a man saying what a very damaging impact that has had on his sense of himself as a provider and as a person and as a worthwhile member of our community. So we need to think about, the very damaging impacts of many of these situations, which are ultimately the result of socio-economic policies. So in other words, we need to think about meanings. It's not just this happened, but we need to understand what that meant, and what that felt like from the point of view of the person and their family and social group. So a lot of therapies talk about meanings. In essence, therapy is about constructing meanings, isn't it? Trying to help people create different meanings about themselves and their circumstances, change the more damaging meanings that are about shame or failure or whatever. But we wanted to expand our understanding of meaning in the framework well beyond the kind of meaning that's inside our heads, but to think about where these meanings actually come from. So if we think about meanings at a wider sense, this is an example I often use. I've worked with many women who've been raped or abused, and probably several hundred of them over the years in my time as a clinical psychologist. Each and every one just about was carrying a very personal meaning in their heads to do with feeling guilty and ashamed. It was my fault. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. This is so terrible. I can't tell anyone. And after you've worked with a number of these women, it's only sensible, I think, to ask, well, where do these meanings come from? Have they just spontaneously arisen within each individual woman that she's kept secret and full of shame for often decades? And of course, the meanings come from around us. The meaning comes from all sorts of social messages about women and their behaviour and men and their behaviour and what's acceptable and what isn't and who's responsible. And we could also say that there is an ideologically driven interest and drive to persuade the victims of these terrible events to take the shame on themselves in a very personal and private way, such that we are shielded as a whole society from looking very clearly at the widespread impact of violence that happens routinely in girls' and women's lives. And there are equivalent examples for men, of course. So the man in the previous quote is feeling a very personal sense of shame and inadequacy because he has lost his job, and yet there may be very little control over that, and there may similarly be ideological interests in people taking on that as a very personal sense of failure, rather than looking more widely at the need of everybody to feel that they're contributing to their community and support their families. So one way of working as a psychologist is to, for example, as I did when I was working in South Wales, set up with my colleagues groups of women who are survivors of sexual abuse, where we could actually trace some of these meanings back to their source and that enables people to put some of the responsibility back where it belongs and to free themselves, at least to some extent, from very personal senses of shame and blame and failure. The fourth question, what did you have to do to survive? So this is what might roughly be called symptoms in psychiatry. In the framework terms, these are threat responses. We've all evolved to respond to threats, but actually in the framework, these are not symptoms to be medicated away. These are creative and necessary survival strategies at the time, but they may have outlived their usefulness. And this includes the things that we call symptoms of psychosis. So threat responses are there for a good reason. And here's some examples of threat responses. You could translate this into diagnostic language, but actually we are seeing these on the basis of a good deal of evidence as understandable survival reactions that people developed. So hearing voices, for example, are said to be a symptom of psychosis from a PTM framework point of view, but also from a trauma-informed perspective. Hearing voices is very often the result of a mechanism called dissociation, whereby we cut off from emotionally overwhelming events. We actually store those memories in a different part of our brain. We may not consciously remember them, but they leak out in the form of unusual beliefs or voice hearing. So the framework would suggest we need to go through a sensitive process of linking the threat response back to the threat. So one of the examples I often give is of a young man that I worked with, whose symptom of schizophrenia in diagnostic language was the sound of a screaming woman in his head, which was intensely distressing for him. If we were in a workshop, I'd ask you to make some guesses about that, but in fact, the team made some guesses about that, and perhaps not surprisingly, it turned out there was a hidden history of domestic violence when he was growing up. He had been forced to witness his dad beating up his mum, and the screaming voice was his mother. So this is a kind of trauma memory, if you like, or a threat response in PTMF language. And once you've got that kind of understanding, linking the threat response to the threat, you have a very different way forward. It's not a young man who unfortunately has developed schizophrenia. It's a young man who is the survivor of very traumatic events. Okay, so threat responses are there for a good reason. As I've just said, the framework helps us to link the threat responses to the threats. So-called symptoms may be clues. And also it's important to say that threat responses don't exactly correspond to symptoms, because socially valued ways of reacting and behaving, which may in fact be quite damaging to us, so they're in line with social expectations, like, let's say, working too hard. That's one of mine. That's not going to get me diagnosed and locked up, but it can, for some people in some circumstances, be seen as a threat response. And conversely, some things that aren't seen as threat responses, being very compliant in psychiatric services, may not be what the person actually most needs to do. That may actually be a threat response to, let's say, authorities or people who are seen as potentially scary or dangerous. So the power threat meaning framework shows how we can restore the links between threats and threat responses. Another way of saying the same thing is restore the link between personal, family, social, community distress and social injustice. And one of the puzzling things I think about this is, at some level we know this. We know that people living in poverty are more likely to have what you might call depression, what I would call feeling extremely miserable and desperate. And we know that at one level that's common sense. And yet as soon as we acknowledge that, we then tend to go off down a diagnostic pathway and talk about epidemics of depression. At the moment, epidemics of mental health problems. We're all meant to be suffering from an epidemic of mental health problems, which is arising entirely coincidentally on the background of an epidemic of a deadly virus, which is leaving many of us isolated and desperate and separated from our loved ones and our friends and worried about illness ourselves. So not surprising, this is not an epidemic of mental health problems. These are understandable responses to very different circumstances. Same, with what we call psychosis or schizophrenia. There are very commonly traumatic events in the early lives of and later lives of people with that diagnosis. And once you know about that, it's very possible to make sense of what we might otherwise call symptoms. But of course, there are, from the framework point of view, many vested interests in disconnecting the threat from the threat response, of which diagnosis is one. Okay, so I'm going to give you a very, very brief example of somebody who used the framework entirely without professional support as part of a peer group. She'd come across this, she facilitates a peer support group, has permitted me to use this example, and this is a woman who was enabled by finding the framework to rewrite her story from person with borderline personality disorder to survivor of very difficult circumstances. So she looked at the questions in relation to her own life. I'm going to whiz through this fairly quickly. As I say, if you don't have time to read it all, you can come back to it. So she had a number of very difficult events in her past, which is very common in people who end up in psychiatric services. And one of her threat responses was to be a good patient, a way of surviving the psychiatric system, which can very often be re-traumatizing. She experienced a number of what we might call symptoms, but from a framework point of view are understandable responses to the abuse she experienced, and it affected her on a biological level, on a bodily level, because the framework is about bodies, not just minds, but it's not about the chemical imbalance that caused my mental illness. It's about the way my body has mediated and expressed the difficult experiences I've been through. She had developed a number of beliefs about being worthless and defective, and how the world and people lived were not trustworthy. She has used a number of survival responses. This is how she understandably tried to survive the very difficult circumstances she had been in, and to some extent still found herself in. Sorry, this is going to be a bit of a whiz through because I want to have a little bit of time for questions. She also has a number of strengths, and these are the things that diagnostic understandings don't really allow for. By definition, a diagnosis is what's wrong with you, and the framework is also very much about what's right with you. I can see some people saying, yeah, I'll come back to those questions in a minute. So to summarize, this is how she put it together. This is her story. This is an alternative to a diagnosis. This is an alternative to believing it's because I have a personality disorder. And while it acknowledges the very difficult events in her life, I think you can also see it's a much more hopeful story. And I'm very pleased to say that Amanda, which is her name, and her peer group have actually joined us on the committee and have now become trainers themselves. They offer training to people in the framework, which from their perspective has come very much from thinking about it in terms of their own lives and experiences, not from a professional background, but that's equally, if not more, valid. So that's the world's quickest whiz through, and there's a lot more I could say. I'm sorry it's been rather brief, but before we do the exercise, I would like to have a little bit of time to ask questions, either if you're feeling brave verbally or through the chat room. Okay, so I'm just having a quick look at the chat room. Looks like people get the idea, think it makes sense to them. Saying this is a way forward. Okay, excellent. Any brief comments, questions? Disagreements, welcome to disagree. Are there any specific cases for which PTMF would not be a solution? That's an interesting question. Well, the framework is mainly about people who fall into the category of what is sometimes called functional psychiatric disorders. In other words, people for whom there is not a known biological cause of some sort. So that's the main business of psychiatry: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorder, clinical depression, anxiety disorders. And none of those are terms we would use, but it's about that broad group of people. Now, psychiatry does include officially in the diagnostic manuals things like dementia and forms of learning disabilities and so on, which are known to be related, to something mainly that's gone wrong in your developmental stages, or perhaps in the case of dementia in your brain. So in that case, you'd have a rather different narrative, wouldn't you? Because it'd be legitimate to have a diagnosis. But you could still use the framework, if you like, to fill out the diagnosis. So someone with dementia will also have aspects of their life that are to do with what sense they make of their experiences and what resources they have and so on. So people are using the framework also in settings like health psychology, for example, where someone might have a perfectly legitimate diagnosis of cancer, let's say, of some sort, but they don't need to be told at the same time you develop depression because you've been told you have a diagnosis of cancer. They need perhaps to have a different way of understanding that this is a very reasonable and response to a difficult life circumstance. And let's think about the holistic view of the experiences that you're going through at the moment. Okay, is there much research on how effective this framework is? That's a good question. I understand you've got a very difficult essay title, Evaluate the Framework. I wouldn't like to do that myself. So we've had quite a lot of criticism of the framework. You may have come across it. There's a lot of people that don't like it. Now you can read that in various ways. One is that it's imperfect and evolving, which it is. There are many ways it needs to evolve. To the extent that the framework consists very largely of very personal, unpleasant attacks on me, I think we may be looking at threat responses, because actually what the framework is doing in a way is providing a very strong challenge to certain forms of power, but it's not perfect. And one of the criticisms is, well, it's not evidenced. And our response to that would be, it's a set of principles and ideas, and the principles and ideas are based on a very, very firmly evidence-based footing. And we have a 200,000 word overview called the main document, which summarizes the evidence. Now, you might read the evidence differently, but it's not true to say the framework is not evidenced. The principles are evidenced. Now, do these principles work in practice? Well, we don't know, because we didn't set out to say exactly how they should be turned into practice, but the idea of the committee and the subsequent developments is to encourage people to translate some of these principles into practice and then evaluate those and research those. So there's a number of projects going on, of which the biggest is the one in a North London set of inpatient wards, of translating the principles into practice, evaluating that, feeding back into the framework. So we're in the process of collecting more evaluations. But I mean, you can't evaluate the framework as a whole, if you like. You can only evaluate it by the implications of what that might look like in practice, and looking at that in more detail. Okay, are we able to join the framework to be trained by people like Amanda, as you said? Anyone who's interested, keep in touch via Jason. We can arrange training sessions by Amanda and her group if you're interested, or look on the website to see what's available and what resources are coming up there. Somebody's saying they like the way the framework includes the systemic and political aspects, which is good. That's essentially what it's about. It's saying distress is inevitably and inherently a matter of sociological and political aspects, not just individualized distress. How can we use this framework as a future clinical psychologist or a person who lives in a threatening environment and has no solutions? Well, it's very true that we mustn't fall into the mistake of thinking the threat is always in the past. The threat may very well be in the present. The person may be living currently in poverty or currently in a violent relationship. And, the framework is not claiming to provide easy answers. At the very least, I think the framework would encourage us not to kind of mystify the person by saying, in effect, there's something wrong with you for feeling depressed in these circumstances, the framework would very clearly want to say to someone, it's not because you're mentally ill, it's because you're living in a very difficult environment. And the framework would want to look not just at therapy as a way forward, though it may help some people, but about whatever we can do, even in small ways, to improve people's current environments, which may be very practical steps. And I think we also have to be honest and say that many of these solutions can only happen at a bigger, wider level. We cannot have purely psychological, purely psychiatric, purely service-led solutions to distress. You know, there's no magic answers, but ultimately the answers are that we want the framework to be taken on also by policymakers, by by organisations at a bigger level, and which can help to campaign for living in a kind of essentially a juster, fairer society. And it'd be very nice to think that we might come out of COVID as a society which has highlighted in such an appalling way the inequalities we're all facing. It'd be nice to think we came out as a juster, fairer society. That's the single thing we can do most effectively. This is an evidence-based statement to reduce the level of distress. Okay. Regarding Amanda and her being able to work through this framework alone, in fact, Amanda worked through this with her peer group. They decided to meet every week and look together at a particular question and help and support each other. You can work through it on your own. It's easier to do it with someone and throw ideas backwards and forwards. Is there a degree to which someone would need the professional help to work through it? Well, we designed it so that it doesn't need professional help. And we're pleased that a couple of peer groups have taken this up and have discovered we can do it ourselves. And, you know, I don't want to dismiss the importance of professional help. It's very important for some people. And I also think we have historically very much downplayed people's own abilities to make meaning and narrative and structure out of their own lives. And in a way, the framework wants to give people tools to do that. So I can send these links to these articles, but there are 2 articles by 2 different peer groups showing how they did that entirely for themselves without any professional input. I'm going to give you, my very last slide is a book that's coming out on the 12th of this month, which is a very practical and more accessible way of thinking about the framework in relation to your own life or the life someone you're supporting with or working. And if any of you want to take it forward, I'm afraid it does mean forking out 11 quid unless you can get it through the library. That would be a useful next step, we hope. Thank you. That's great to have so many questions coming up, and I could easily talk about this all day, in fact for several days, as you can probably tell, but I'd like to move on to an exercise now. And so I'm going to share screen again and explain this exercise. So this is what we're going to do, except we're going to do it very slightly differently from what I've put up here. So you have all, I think, been sent a one-side summary of a case of a man called Matt. Did everybody get that? And if not, I think it might be possible to put it up, Kimberly, if people are saying they didn't get it.
Sure, it was posted on the modules and I emailed it to them as well. Did everybody get to read that? Okay, good. Did you want to, you're sharing your screen right now, so I can't share the case of Matt. Do you want to put up the case of Matt now?
Let's do that in a minute when everyone's doing okay. The other thing you'll need to have access to, which also went around by email, is a thing called the guided discussion.
They have that as well.
Yes, great. So in a minute, you're going to be divided magically into 4 groups, not into 4 groups, into 5 groups. And don't read what it says under the bullet point there. Each group is going to consider a different aspect of the framework questions. And I think Kimberly is going to helpfully put this in the chat room so you can be reminded. So groups 1 to 5, I think you're going to think about the question power. And we're going to think those groups are going to think about it by looking at Matt's story, reminding yourself of Matt's story and having a discussion together about what are the aspects of power that may be operating in Matt's life, and you can make some guesses. And you can use the guided discussion prompts to do that. So if you look at the guided discussion, you will see about 2 pages in, it's got some prompts about the forms of power that may be operating in someone's life. So think about those in relation to Matt. So I think that's groups 1 to 5, but it'll go up in the chat room. Groups 6 to 10, I think it will be, is going to think about the next core question, which is about threats. So exactly the same. We'll look at the story of Matt, look at the section in the guided discussion that is about that question about threats, think about the threats that Matt may have experienced in his life. Okay, next group, that'll be groups, tell me if I'm starting to get this wrong, 10 to 15 is going to think about the third question, meanings, look at the guided discussion for the prompts. Next set of groups, 16 to 20, is going to think about threat responses in relation to Matt's life. And the final set of groups, 21 to 25, is going to think about what strengths Matt has. So this is about making guesses. It's about not getting too worried about, is this a threat or a threat response, or is this a meaning or a threat? They're overlapping questions. It's to get our thoughts going and to think a bit about what this might look like in practice with a real life person, Matt, who's consented to share his story. Does that make sense to people? Yeah, if that makes sense, then Kim, you could put the thing of Matt up in case anyone hasn't got it, and you could start the discussion groups, which I think are going to run for about 15 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Absolutely. I put the groups up there and what you'll be thinking about when you're assigned to your group. So you can go ahead and copy down for all of the groups because you don't know which group you'll be assigned to yet. It's random allocation. And then I've also linked the case vignette. I put the file for the case vignette into the chat. And then I'm looking for that guided discussion file as well. So those are the 2 files that you have there. Okay. And there's your case vignette. And I'm going to go ahead and do the breakout rooms. Now, are there any questions before we go out into our breakout rooms? Okay, you can stick around and ask them. Lucy, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Yes, of course, sorry.
No, it's no problem.
Whoa.
And I'm going to pause the recording so that people aren't sitting there for 15. Good for you, iPhone. Not sure who you are, but I'm very glad you got there. All right, Lucy, I'll go ahead and mute myself if you want to. They're going to all close in another 26 seconds. So you can go ahead and share your screen then, okay?
Okay, I will do that. So if you can, sorry, Kim, if you could let me know when everyone's back.
I will. We still have 76 people in breakout rooms, so wait just a minute or 2.
Okay.
All right, I think we're up above 100, so you can go ahead and get started if you want. That's usually my cutoff.
Great. Hello again, everyone. I hope you had a bit of time to think and talk about that. If we were face to face, I would have done it a bit differently. And one of the ways you can do this a bit differently, this exercise we've just done, is by encouraging a whole staff team to think together about someone like Matt. So one of the ways I sometimes do this exercise is to say, imagine you're a member of the staff on the ward where Matt's just been readmitted for the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 10th time, and you're all feeling very fed up and stuck, and you see him as having chronic schizophrenia and you don't know how to go forward. So imagine that the staff are then talked through this way of thinking about Matt. So the jargon term for that is a team formulation. The team is meeting together to think about Matt in a different way. And this is something that a number of teams have been taking up, this particular way of helping staff to think about someone who seems very stuck in the system to move forward by viewing their problems in a different way, by changing the narrative. Because by the time someone's been in services a while, if the staff are very stuck in a narrative of this is schizophrenia, then it's likely that the service user will be too. So, but we can't do it exactly like that. So instead, I'm going to go through some of the thoughts that you might have had in relation to Matt and the core questions. And I've rather than ask you, I've put up some ideas here, and if anyone has things that they wanted to add, then please let me know. And sorry, I need to have my chat thing open, don't I? In order to get responses from you. Right, more. Okay, so I'm just trying to open my chat thing. Can't see the chat function. Have a look at the things I've got up there in relation to Matt and the influence of power, and see if you think there's anything else that perhaps could and should be up there. So, sorry, I'm still trying to find my chat function. As I think you can see, Matt has experienced the impact of a whole number of different forms of power in his life in all the ways that the framework suggests might be the case. I'm going to click on chat. Still can't see the chat function. That's a bit annoying. Sorry, Kim, can you tell me if any suggestions are coming up in the chat room? Is there anything else additional about power that...
Absolutely. So let's see, the question is, isn't it problematic to view Matt as someone who had no hope for recovery, as mentioned in the case? We don't have anything specifically about power yet.
No, I'm just looking for any aspects of power.
Any aspects of power that influenced Matt? Yes,
that you come up with. There's no, you know, in a way, no right or wrong answers. It's just people's thoughts, isn't it?
Let's see. Anyone want to post in chat?
People don't have ideas. I can do a little summary of, I mean, I guess if you did have ideas, it's likely to be along the lines of the things I've put there.
Or you can always unmic yourself, guys.
Yeah. Anybody want to add anything? Okay, so what I'm going to do a little summary then. I'm assuming these are the kind of ideas you would probably have come up with. So, and if you were a staff team, I'd be doing this kind of summary as well. So I'd be saying something like, I think we can see very clearly that Matt has experienced an awful lot of very difficult events in his life. And we kind of know that already because we have the history, but it's really important to spell these out because I think this helps the staff team to start realizing, you know, this guy really has had a very difficult time. And perhaps that helps the staff view to start shifting towards, it's not surprising he feels like that. And as you can see, what I put under the headings of power, it's not just the obvious things like, you know, violence in the home and outside and all the rest of it. It's the more subtle things like he felt he didn't fit in. He felt he couldn't join in with a particular set of religious or political beliefs that were around when he was growing up. And those forms of not fitting in can be just as damaging and distressing in some ways as the more obvious things that he faced. So those are the many forms of power, negative forms of power that Matt faced that probably made his experiences more understandable. One of the things I always say to people is there's probably more going on that we don't know about. You know, for example, homelessness. It's quite likely he was beaten up on the street, for example. The list of power abuses we might come up with is nearly always an incomplete list, and it nearly always takes quite a long time to find out the full picture, but nevertheless, that's a start of it. How did it affect you? So have a look at this. And this is some of the ways that I'm suggesting that Matt was affected by the impact of power. And again, as we can see, this helps us to, I hope, to get inside his life and his head a little bit and think, well, really, he was facing, you know, threats in all sorts of different ways. There was hardly any area of his life, although he had a relatively good start in life compared to some people, but actually overall there was hardly any area in his life where he didn't face, you know, very difficult power impacts in the PTMF language terms. And I said that includes not just obviously threatening things, but more subtle things like who am I and what do I believe and what kind of life do I want to live. I would always encourage people to think about the impact of drugs and ECT. Unfortunately, this is what often happens in services that, you know, that the so-called treatments we offer have negative effects of their own, and these may in fact repeat the experiences or be experienced as a repeat of the experiences that bring people into services in the first place. one of the things I would also say is that it's quite common for people to come into services not being very clear who they are and what their identity is and what kind of life they want to lead. And in that case, when we give someone identity, you are a mental health patient, they are probably not going to feel confident enough to resist that. And indeed, they may not be aware of the information that actually you don't have to understand your problems in this way, but they are actually encouraged to take on an identity which is on the whole a very damaging one. It's really the last thing they need. Did anyone have anything to add to the threats? Any of the groups that were considering that? Anything? I'll assume there isn't anything in the chat room. If
There's nothing in the chat room right now, Lucy.
okay, thank you.
Does anybody want to say anything there?
Hello. I've got a few things.
Yeah, sorry. Put them back then.
No, that's fine. Would you rather me put them in the chat or speak them?
Speak them, please, because I can't see the chat at the moment.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I've got a lot of stuff, so stop me if I just go on a rant, okay? So the first thing that we came up with as a group was that he was born as the youngest child, as a male, with 2 older sisters. So that would have given him a threat of emasculation or being the youngest, the weakest, and the smallest. So those are threats there to his identity. Identity was the main theme we kept coming back to. Also, he had no positive male role model. The whole issue with his parents' faith being involved with the church, I felt that there was a potential for cognitive dissonance where his behaviors and his thoughts and feelings didn't line up fully, and he didn't feel like he was connecting fully with his parents because they believed it, but he wasn't fully convinced. And then his faith was an issue, which actually later on when he had this issue with the entity that was bothering him with his psychosis, he felt damnation, like, spiritual damnation was an issue coming forward for him. Then a little bit later on, so his disjointed sibling relationships was sort of a starter for his later relationships. It did say that he couldn't open up fully when he resorted to drug use. So either he didn't feel he could share or he didn't feel he could seek comfort from others. So those are social threats that he had, and he lacked a social structure. So there's another issue. The drug use is escapism, as we put together. He left school without qualifications, so threat there from the world of employment, of opportunity. The scaffold for building a life following education. He didn't have that, so there's a massive threat there. He ended up homeless, and then the interesting thing was when he finally found a group of people he felt he could belong with, or at least was somewhat accepted with the Aboriginals, he was ousted by immigration. So again, the threat there was from society again, that he was unwanted, and he was immediately kicked back to the UK. And just to wrap it all up now, his experience later with psychiatric care, when he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, that would have been another threat to his identity. He's now got to think, am I this messed up person? And then he was threatened with detention if he attempted to leave the psychiatric care. And again, there was this theme of submission to authority, but also being in a position of less power. So there was this threat constantly from someone above him, and whether it was the school, his parents, or the people who were supposed to be looking after him, So overall then, when he was finally seen as a person with low hope for recovery, it was just like the last nail in the coffin to solidify his identity as a person who just had no hope.
Excellent, thank you very much. And thank you to your group. Sounds like you had a really productive discussion.
Thank you.
All of those things sound very plausible. One of the things we have to remember is this is our story about Matt's story, so to speak. So we would want, as I'm sure you're aware, we want to check this out with Matt, wouldn't we? But everything you've said and your group has said sounds very plausible. And interestingly, as I said, the questions overlap. In thinking about threat, you've also been thinking about power, haven't you? You've also been thinking about meaning, and you've also been thinking about threat responses. So we'll pick up some of those things as we get to those questions. But that all sounds very plausible to me. I think it's particularly interesting the way you picked up on identity and on the ways in which things are kind of playing into each other or perpetuating, aren't they? So he already feels scared of authority, ends up in hospital with a lot of people who have a lot of power over him. He already doesn't have a sense of identity, and he's given another very rather damaging identity. So that all makes a lot of sense. well, partly, well, it makes sense to me because I know Matt, but I think it makes sense from the point of view of the story. So thank you for all those thoughts. Let's go on to the next one. So interesting, I think this came up in what you just said, John, it is, isn't it? You mentioned a sense of damnation.
Lucy, really quickly, we also had, if Matt stopped practicing sports, could that be a bodily threat?
It could be, yes, it could be. You know, he's at risk of, you know, losing his abilities or whatever. And it could also be a threat response. I mean, it doesn't matter too much which heading you, and some of these aspects will fit under several headings. Yeah. So it could be said that giving up sport was also a kind of threat response. I can't bear the feeling of, you know, doing this for other people, not for myself, so I'm going to stop doing it, or I feel like I won't be good enough, so I'll stop doing it. So all of these things imply meanings, and here's some meanings that, you know, this is my guess about someone else's experience. We'd have to check it out with him. We can, I think, at least, you know, imagine that any of those things, these meanings and feelings might be true. And I'm interested that the feedback came up from the group we've just heard about damnation. I've got sinful up there. There was something about that whole experience of the entity at school that felt to me like something more than just scary. And the information we have about his difficult relationship with the church suggested something that, you know, might have been more than I'm a bad, worthless person, which is a common belief, unfortunately. Might have been more than I'm a sinful, damned person. Did anyone else have any other thoughts about the meanings that Matt might have attributed? Yes. Anything come up in the chat room?
We don't have anything that this is groups 11 through 15. Did you have any of the meaning comments about the meaning for Matt? You can put it in chat, or somebody want to unmute from those groups.
Fine if we don't. I think we've got a kind of fairly...
Let's say they said again that he felt he had no identity.
Yeah, good one. Yeah. So their theme of identity, lack of identity coming through, yes, which could simply be a sort of who am I, a sort of sense of insecurity about who I am. So that also sounds reasonable. As I said, it's our story about his story, but we're continuing the process of trying to put ourselves in his shoes, in his mind, in his feelings. So we hope by now the staff are continuing on their journey of it seems to make sense without necessarily having to call this schizophrenia, because for goodness, how would I be feeling in the same circumstances?
See, he saw his environment as a lie, seeing his family and community as hypocrites. From Gatiana, and oh goodness, sorry, we just had a little jump there. Unsafe, helpless, lonely, excluded, different, helpless and defeated. From Zach, Matt used drugs from a young age as a means of coping. He also gave up on the challenge of schoolwork. This idea of giving up is reinforced by his suicidal ideation, or is reinforced in his suicidal ideation. Also concealing things from his friends, as he perceived being different as contentious, and probably didn't want to cause any controversy. This could also be a response to the power of religion in his life, as his psychotic episode was used as a sign of damnation. And Aaron said, thinking those things we would need to ask Matt, is it's not written from his perspective, sorry for the noise, but there are some aspects like the damnation and hypocrisy of the adults in his life.
So that group had a good discussion, and some of those coming up in that were threat responses, weren't they, which we're looking at now.
Sorry, I think I was in group 15 and we were talking about meanings. My group, we were talking about the meanings, and we felt like every single word, every single meaning can be applied to Matt at least at one point of his life. So a lot of them applied to him, especially when he was at a young age, but some of them carried with him as he got older. I think a specific sentence in the vignette that we were provided that I felt was really interesting is that he felt, and let me just read it, that the entity he had seen related to a sense of damnation, and that he was urged to give himself to God but could not do so. That the ending that he could not do so was really interesting to me, because I felt like even then he felt like he was contaminated or evil, that even though
Yeah.
he experienced something where he was supposed to give himself to God, but even then he couldn't even do so. Like, it was interesting because why would he think that specifically? And I felt like that all of it, everything he was experiencing, like he was such an outsider, he was so isolated, and he was alien and dangerous and just abnormal in every sense of the way, from his family, from his school, from his town. So all of that, like, I feel like piled up on him and just continued on as he grew older. And I think that was one of the main reasons why he started taking drugs and everything, because he just couldn't deal with it. But at least that's what I got from the
Yeah. Thank you. I think those are really useful and interesting thoughts. Again, we're not putting these forward as this is the truth, but we're putting this forward as it sounds as though this may be the case, and this is what we've noticed, and this is what we're sensing, and this is what we will use to, you know, we will share with Matt in some form in order to help understand his story better. But we need to be able to get there ourselves in our own heads too. We need to be able to relate to Matt and the difficulties he's been through. And I'm interested that several people are picking up on the so-called psychotic experience. You know, he was said to have this psychotic experience, and thinking about that in terms of what clues there were in there, what meanings there were. Several people have picked up it's something about damnation or being unable to give himself to God. It's something religious. So, and I don't think we probably have enough information to go further than that at the moment, but anything so dramatic and so scary is bound to be very significant, isn't it? So I think these are big clues in trauma-informed terms or in framework terms. There's a big clue in there about some things, maybe a number of things that happened. And because they've appeared in this rather unusual form, it suggests that it was something so overwhelming it couldn't be processed at the time. It's kind of leaked out in this scary vision at school. And another thing that I think ideally I'd like to know more about is the voices he heard, because we don't know who they were or what they said, but undoubtedly if we did know, there would be meanings attached to that, and they would also give us clues. Thank you. Yes, did you have another thing?
We've got a few more things in the chat. Do we have time?
Yes, if we're fairly brief about it. I'd love to have more time, but yes.
Okay, we've got, let's see, Eugene, he felt disappointed in the way of life of people he looked up to, the incongruence of laid down rules and practical way of life. He felt trapped in a system not knowing what is truly acceptable. He worked hard at sports and in school to be acceptable and get approval. When that was not forthcoming, he gave up on the need to achieve anything at all. And Jade wanted to know, why did he go to Australia? So that's what I've got so far. Sorry if I missed anything.
Okay, so all those meanings are continuing those. We haven't got trapped up there, but I think we well could have trapped. Yeah. So people are picking up on very similar themes, aren't they? Which is interesting and suggests that perhaps we are picking up on something that is probably meaningful to Matt himself. Let's come back to the Australia question, but one possible way, and we don't know why he went to Australia unless we ask him, but one possible way of understanding it is, was this a kind of threat response? You know, is this a way of escaping? You know, killing yourself is one way of escaping. A rather different way of escaping might be, I can find a new life and a new self in Australia. Is that a threat response? And some of these threat responses have already come up. People have noticed he took drugs, he felt suicidal, and the point of where we are now in terms of imagining there's a staff team there, we're, I hope, able to make the link between the threat responses and the threats. So we're not just saying he's got this symptom, this symptom, this symptom. We're saying he feels like this possibly because he was trying to survive this. He feels like this possibly because he could not cope with this. He's behaving like this possibly because these awful things happened to him. Yep. And some of these are symptoms, but things like being a bit secretive aren't psychiatric symptoms. Going to Australia isn't a psychiatric symptom, but it can perhaps be seen as a threat response. Anybody have anything to add to that?
They did. So we've got the threat responses shown in the suicidal thoughts and drug use, and tried to get away from his family and friends as an escape. So just what you saw there.
Yeah.
We've got some strengths coming up, but hold on to those for just.
Yes, hold on to the strengths.
Yes. Let's see. Sorry if you hear a cat in the background. I think that's what we got for threats. So we got 16 through 20, group 16 through 20. Did you want to say anything else?
Let's go on to strengths.
Okay.
So these are some things I made a guess at. And any other thoughts about his strengths? Of course, typically we don't get strengths when we hear the story of someone who's supposed to be mentally ill. We get all the things that are difficult for them.
You've got a lot of strengths: intelligence,
yes,
sport, faith, sociability. Sorry, did you want the strengths in the chat?
Yeah, yes, no, yes. Read out what the chat room is saying about strengths.
Okay, let's see from Morgan, and then community support, and maybe question is, could an act of rebellion be considered a strength from his perspective?
It could.
That's a good point. And then let's see, from Lucas, good at sport, did well at school, the early stage courage to leave the UK for Australia. Could have been an escape, but it takes courage to leave and change your situation.
Indeed, absolutely.
And then let's see, sense of belonging, heavily involved in church and sports, abilities, excelled at football and badminton. And that is from Francesca. I think that's what I've got so far.
Thank you. And it sounds like we could carry on and discuss this further, but I've got my eye on the time. But thank you for all those suggestions. So very briefly, if we'd reached this point in a discussion with a team, we would hope that the team must have moved some way, at least from chronic schizophrenic, no way forward, to survivor of very difficult circumstances who still have a lot of potential in his life. And if the team's able to start to see Matt differently, they are, we hope, going to be able to talk to Matt in different ways, to suggest different ways forward, and to help him move beyond this psychiatric narrative that he's stuck in. Because actually, by the time we've reached this point, we are much more able to see it's not surprising he has these experiences, and actually he's still got a lot going from him. It's extraordinary that he's still here with us and still seems to have some hope for recovery. And we need to have hope for his recovery too. So then I would hope to do something which we haven't got time for today, to think about what ways forward might this suggest. So if this is a staff team, one of the things we need to think about is how can we feed this back to Matt? So we perhaps do that with some kind of conversation about, we've had to think about your difficulties. I don't think we really realise what you've been through. We are wondering if perhaps a lot of this is understandable. With any luck, you might be able to get his diagnosis lifted. We think that this is actually a trauma reaction, and we may have got it wrong when we said it was schizophrenia. We may be able to suggest all sorts of ways forward, which might be quite simple things. We've noticed how excluded he feels, how isolated he feels. You know, could he get in touch with some of his former friends or the members of staff who could watch football with him on telly if that used to be one of his interests? Can we relate to him much more as a person than as a kind of psychiatric patient? So much as I'd like to continue talking about that with you, I'm keeping an idea on the time, an eye on the time, so I'm going to stop share, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Matt himself, and then we're going to meet him on video. So the update of Matt's story was that, this was all a number of years ago now, he was actually lucky enough to be referred to a shared housing project for people who are said to have chronic long-term mental health difficulties, where he gradually was able to find somewhere that he could fit in, a bit like the Aboriginal group. It was a group of very marginalised people, but it was a group of people that he was able to fit in with and form a community with. He was lucky enough to have several years of psychotherapy. I don't know how available that would be nowadays. During that time, he gradually stopped feeling suicidal and gradually stopped hearing voices. And he continued to start to get to feel more at ease in the world by taking up surfing and sporting activities. And eventually he retrained as a mental health nurse, emigrated to Australia, and actually won an award for Australian Mental Health Nurse of the Year in 2017. So did very well, lives in Australia, has a partner and 3 children. And I met him when I went to Australia with the Power Threat Meaning Framework to do some workshops, and he was part of the organisation that put on one of the workshops. And I said to him, I wonder if you would consider us using your story, Matt, so that in the workshop we can practice looking at it through a power threat meaning framework lens, a bit like we've just done just now as a group. So he generously said yes, but he did, so he put together his story, but anonymously, so we called him Nick. And then we had this rather strange experience where I introduced this case history of Nick, and we did exactly what we've just done now. The whole group thought about it from a point of view of the framework core questions. And then I said, would you like to meet Nick, the real Nick? And I said, actually, this is the real Nick, Matt, who's co-hosting the workshop with me. So he had the experience of looking on at us, thinking about his story. And that was a very powerful training exercise. And I can't produce Matt in person for you, but what we did a couple of weeks ago is to record a discussion between me and Matt in which we reflected on our experience of putting together his story and thinking about, you know, the additional insights that the framework had given him, given he's already a long way down the work. You know, he had, you know, in all sensible respects recovered, but he had some interesting thoughts about how the framework helped him to take some further steps. So I'm now going to show you, or rather Kim, I hope, is going to show you this video. And Kim, there's a sort of slight pause at 13 minutes when we could stop the video, so we won't watch the whole of it. But I think
Okay.
when we get to 13, you'll see it fades out, and then
Okay.
we'll stop it at that point.
Sounds great. I'll go ahead and start it now then.
Of using the power threats. Hello, my name's Matt Ball. I'm a nurse practitioner and therapist in Adelaide, Australia, originally from England. And I'm here today with Lucy to talk about our experiences of using the power threat meaning framework in the story of my life, I suppose, and how we did that together and shared that journey. Lucy, I don't know if you want to introduce anything.
Lovely to be with you again, Matt, at a considerable distance, of course.
Yeah.
And I'm Lucy Johnstone. I'm one of the lead authors of the framework, and I was privileged to take part in the development of Matt's story, which he's generously agreed to help to, you know, put together some reflections about, so that we can use it ultimately as a training exercise, among other things. So great to be here.
Yeah, it's really nice to connect again. It's been happening since we started developing the story. We've crossed over and met in various ways since then, haven't we? So
Indeed, and it kind of happened by accident in a way, didn't it? I was coming to Australia. You were part of one of the organisations that was hosting the PTM framework.
yeah.
And I, with some hesitation, asked if you would be willing for you to use your story as a kind of illustrative example of some of the principles of the framework.
Yes, and I think that sort of accidental nature of it was probably has given it the richness of developing the story, really. Because I remember when we first started speaking and you asked me if we could do it, I was sitting in the sunshine on a Zoom call as I started telling you about my life, and it was all quite surreal. Just not long after the PTMF had come out, and I think one of the things I noticed instantly was something about your sort of curiosity in me describing the story, so that you could make some notes and begin putting together a narrative, really, on paper of what I thought had happened in my life along the way. And maybe I can say, for those that don't know of me, I have a lived experience of being told I had a diagnosis and spending more time than I'd probably like in the mental health system. And so that was what I mean by the idea that it was fascinating, is the word I noticed at the time, to have someone listening to me tell a story from my life, but without any real intention other than to gather the words that I would say.
Lucy, it says there's a problem with this part of the
Yeah. Can we stop and start it again?
video. Let's just see if I can press play.
That's a bit annoying.
Sorry, everyone. Hold on for a sec.
Hello, my name's Matt.
This story, didn't we, over a period of emails to and fro, so that the way we eventually used it was that after introducing the framework in the workshop, I used your story under a pseudonym.
Yes.
And we collectively put together some ideas about how we might view your story from a PTM framework, and then you stood up and said, actually, I'm Nick.
Yes.
I think that was a pretty powerful moment for the attenders, but it must also have felt a little bit strange for you to be listening, in essence, for people reflecting on your story, and you were sitting there anonymously.
Yes, I think that it was a very powerful moment, and one particular thing happened. So we were in Adelaide, you were in Adelaide, and John Crombie was here, and I'd spoken on my subject, and you two had introduced the framework, and others had spoken, and yes, I was going under a pseudonym because at the time there was stuff from my life that I hadn't shared before in public. I hadn't shared with you when we first began to write the story, really, and it was very powerful. Not only hearing people discuss and formulate around my life through the use of the Power Threat Meaning Framework, but the very content that I hadn't shared with anyone. Someone in the audience suggested, "Oh, I wonder if this had happened to Nick," not knowing it was me, and it really personified for me that the power of telling stories and then sharing the telling of stories was that other people hear things even without hearing the words. And if we're tentative and nudging towards a shared story, then those new ideas will come out. And that was probably the single most powerful thing when a friend of mine who didn't know this was my story said, "Oh, I wonder if this has happened to Nick."
I remember that moment. It was indeed very powerful, and as you say, it shows it shows a number of things. You know, a story is always evolving. We had what looked like a fairly complete story, but actually a large bit of it was still kind of in shadow, and it showed how constructing or co-constructing a story can lead people to a place where they're ready to think about, perhaps disclose other aspects that have previously been hidden. And it does show, as you say, there's a kind of, actually the clues were there.
Yes.
Who picked it up in retrospect, I think we can see why she did that, although this plot of your story had actually remained hidden for so many years.
And on that, it's interesting, the woman that picked it up was not a mental health professional or didn't even identify as a person with a lived experience in terms of working in the field. It was just a person who was interested in the Power Threat Meaning Framework and heard within the story another story, and couldn't
absolutely. And the framework, we hope, is really not just about professionals having all their ideas and guessing what's going on. It's about ordinary people's empathy and intuitions, and it's really not just about people who have technically got lived experience, although that is the case for you. But we all have a story, if you like. Yes,
and the two aspects that ran in parallel was you and I developing a story. So when we emailed back and forth, developing a case study to present as Nick under a pseudonym, you also sort of put it under the headings of the Power Threat Meaning and Strengths. And that was the first moment when I really felt in my life telling my story hadn't been looked at through the lens of either overtly or covertly being a problem of a disorder, so I think I've given up on disorders many years ago, but there was still a narrative that, well, okay, you've got better, but maybe there's still, maybe that came from that illness or that problem. So that was between you and me. And then when we were in the workshop with 70 people, 60 or 70 people, and the whole workshop was formulating as a group, it was a very different experience. And I suppose for me, it's something I've taken from that in my clinical work, is to see the difference between doing this one-to-one with someone which is we're using the power threat meaning framework, or
Yeah.
using a team formulation approach.
Yes, that's interesting and very true. And I think what I'd also say is that the way we hope people will use the framework, if they want, is not even necessarily with one-to-one or with a group around them. You know, peer groups are taken up, that's fantastic. But in a way, what we also want to do is to give ordinary people the tools to think about their story through a different lens, without any professionals on the scene and perhaps without other people around at the moment at which you're first thinking about it. So
Yes.
it could be used in a number of different ways.
Yes. And that also reminds me, one of the things that came out of using this case study, so it's a good sort of example for groups, is a mutual friend of ours who was a student social worker ended up using the power threat meaning framework in a sort of mutual self-help group. And that was a very powerful example just of one environment in which it was used.
Well, that was lovely, the number of sort of things that came out of it. And you're using the word formulating, and as a psychologist, of course, that's what I'm trained to do and have trained others to do. But I think, it's also important to add that the framework does understand what we might call formulation in a broader way than the traditional psychological way. So that's why we sometimes use the word narrative and narrative construction instead, because we place quite a strong emphasis on aspects that don't always get highlighted in a more traditional, CBD formulation, let's say, or other type of formulation. We particularly look at aspects of identity and ideological power, actually, which did seem to be relevant in your story, as well as the more obvious traumas and difficulties.
Yeah. And that probably brings us on nicely to something we thought we might talk about here. If people have used this example from the website and sort of looked at formulating, the subject we were talking about that the person in the workshop raised and that I hadn't spoken of was that as a child I experienced sexual abuse in the church in England, and before I did the power threat meaning framework journey with you in terms of developing the story, I'd never told anyone. And it wasn't just the power threat meaning framework and going through it and formulating a story, but there's no doubt to me that what I experienced by developing a kind of narrative around my life that was free of the labels and the structures that you or anybody else might put on them, it gave enough opening in me to start talking about sexual abuse. And that was an extremely powerful story. And my idea behind that is that no one ever asked me in the mental health system, whether I suffered.
Astonishing in itself, isn't it?
Yes. And then so to then retell my story some 15 or 20 years later and realize that there was permission to talk about it, and it was my choice to talk about it or not to talk about it. It was very empowering to say, well, this is going on and this has happened, and this is actually an important part of me creating an understanding of my narrative.
That's very, very interesting and powerful. So once we'd really cleared the disorder off the stage, and of course, as you said, you've done lots of reflecting on your life. You had a pretty good idea of your story. You'd actually had some quite good help eventually within the mental health system, along with some pretty awful stuff.
Yeah.
But in a way, nothing needed to happen, but the stage needed to be clear and you needed to feel, free enough to allow other elements of your story to emerge.
Well, I agree, and that makes me reflect on, I spent a good number of years in psychotherapy in the system, as well as ECT and medication and hospitalisation. But when I went to psychotherapy, the story of the disorder followed me into therapy, or led me into therapy. So the therapy was treating the disorder. There was no room for the new story to emerge, and I think that's what I've experienced. And in the workshop in Adelaide, when Tanya said, we'd done this big formulation, no one in the room knew that I'd been abused as a child, sexually abused as a child. And she said, I do wonder if some sort of sexual abuse happened in the church. And it was an incredible, yes. So
she picked up something that your psychotherapist didn't. And actually, I find that a bit
you know, really any half-decent psychotherapist ought to be at the very least aware of these possibilities, and at the very least exploring them and picking up some of these clues that in retrospect are rather obvious. But, you know, it has been my experience working in services for many years that it can take years for stories to emerge. Actually, even under ideal circumstances, you know, this is a long process, isn't it? There's never a complete story, there's never a finished account, and sometimes the most deeply hidden and painful and shameful bits are, I guess, understandably, the very last to emerge. And, you know, if the framework is one way of providing a setting in which those stories can emerge in a way that feels safe and validating, then that's fantastic. It's not the only way, but it is one way.
Thank you. So you can have the link and watch the rest of the video if you want, but that's there's about another 10 minutes, but that gives us a flavour. Is everybody back? Can people hear me?
I can hear you just fine. And I think
Yeah, okay. So I have 1 or 2 more slides which I might fit in at 2 minutes to 2, but any reflections on that discussion with Matt? Anything anyone wants to ask in the chat room or comment on? We found out a bit more, didn't we, about, well, I guess the thing we were wondering about, the terrifying experience at school, the so-called psychotic experience, which might stand actually for a range of things, but would presumably have very much, you know, pointed towards the abuse that was a secret up till that point. And a secret that was so scary and shameful that it could only kind of leak out in that rather dramatic way that was seen as psychotic. Very touching story, says someone. He claimed power back, contributed to his new narrative and identity. Yep. Yeah, and I think it's interesting, as Chloe's just said, you have to kind of clear the disorder away before you can hear the story in a way. You might hear some of it, but actually the diagnostic narrative obscures people's stories. Someone said one of the main characteristics of psychosis is lack of insight. Oh, I don't know if I agree with that. What does lack of insight mean? It means you disagree with your doctor. However, that is what people say. If our interpretation of someone's experience is simply a hypothesis, how do we move forward? Well, it's a hypothesis. That's what science is about, isn't it? It's hypotheses. We didn't know if our ideas about Matt were true. We have to test that hypothesis in that particular case by checking it out with him. Does that make sense, Matt? That's how we know. And if we develop a plan for intervention support based on our hypothesis, our best guess that works, that's further evidence that we were on the right lines. I mean, that's how we know. We test it out in practice. Would you encourage medication if it helped with that? I mean, the framework is not anti-psychiatric drugs. I don't call them medication because they're not medication in any sensible sense. They don't treat illnesses or rectify chemical imbalance, these drugs, but I mean, they can take the edge off people's distress, you know, which may be valuable for some people at some points. Took Matt 2.5 years to come off all his drugs, and it's a long, painful process for many people, and he's been off them for about 20 years. But I mean, they have some uses for some people at some points. As long as we don't think they're treating illnesses, then I think we can have a shared discussion about, do you find this helpful in kind of getting through the day and taking the edge off the worst aspects of your distress? Any other thoughts? People seem to be saying that was quite a powerful testimony from Matt, which indeed it was. And the chronic schizophrenic, I don't think is recognisable in the person we met. And Matt is an unusual person in lots of ways, but I don't, you know, I have known a number of people who've managed to escape their label in the same way that he has, like Jackie and Eleanor, who were the co-authors on the framework, both survivors of the system, both labelled schizophrenic many years ago, both in different ways escaped from that. So I do believe that anyone can do it. even if someone is still psychotic, they're expressing what's happened to them. Yeah, I mean, you know, the kinds of experience that Matt describes are communications, aren't they? Psychotic experiences are communications. They're communications about really important things. And if we don't pick that up, it's us that's lacking insight, not the patient. Do you use CBT-like approaches once the formulation is complete? Well, I mean, you can use most therapeutic approaches as part of the PTMF broader perspective, depending on not making them too individualizing, I guess. There are forms of CBT that include social narratives and factors and perspectives. There are forms of CBT that are very narrow. So it's not about whether you use CBT or not, it's about whether or not you use CBT or any other therapeutic approach that is compatible with the core principles of the framework, which are very much about linking distress to sort of wider factors and placing meaning at its heart. Once you have an individual's narrative, how do you help someone to move forward? Well, the narrative suggests the way forward is, I suppose, the answer to that. What's a formulation, which is a particular kind of narrative, is the basis for an intervention. That's what psychologists will say it's the basis on which you plan your intervention. In a more general sense, a narrative will suggest the way forward. Like we had some ideas for ways forward for Matt when we imagined him on a ward, but I think I would also say that a narrative is healing in itself. And I think we can see that from Matt's story and discussion there. It is a healing process in itself to put together a narrative. And that, in a way, is the key work that anybody needs to do and the key thing that we as professionals can help people with. And when you get to that point, it's probably obvious to the person themselves what they need to do. So, any other brief comments? We all have a story, absolutely right. It's worth repeating, the framework is not about people who end up in services, it's about all of us. We're all distressed at times, we all experience the impact of power, we all struggle to make sense of our lives, we all have ways of coping. Okay, I'm going to show you just a couple more slides leading up to 10:02 and leading up to 2 o'clock, sorry. So this is repeating a bit what we've just said. I hope people can see that. I'm assuming you can, unless you tell me you can't. So this relates a little bit to the previous question. What do you do when you've got a narrative? Well, in a way, the narrative, constructing the narrative is the work in a way. Recovery is a process of reclaiming our experiences in order to take back authorship of our own stories. You can't do very much before that, and after that, you are on the way to getting to where you need to be. Not to say you won't benefit from other forms of support in a way, but in a way, the narrative is the healing process. And I'm just going to whiz you through some slides from a service in central and northwest London, an inpatient service which took on the power threat meaning framework and trauma-informed practice. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but it's an approach that fits very well with the framework in order to try and change from a very medicalized atmosphere in which there's low staff morale, high levels of violent incidents on the ward, and generally very stuck medicalized feeling about the place. So I've been supervising these people over the last few years. I'll whiz forward a bit. Essentially, the heart of their approach is a weekly 1-hour meeting, a bit like the one we had, but imagine it happening in person with the staff team, where each week they think about a particular person in relation to the core framework questions. They have the whole team there, and they develop a possible way forward based on their discussion of that particular person. So the meeting is structured like this, a bit like we did. Think about the background, think about how we're feeling as a team, think about power resources and power imbalances, threats, meanings, threat responses, how the staff feeling now and ways forward. And that's what it looks like when they've done it. Somebody writes that up and puts it in the notes. That's a a team formulation carried out along power threat meaning framework lines. And along with that, they do a lot of trauma-informed practice, which I don't have time to talk about now, ways of managing feelings of distress that arise out of the impact of trauma. And they've done some evaluations. It looks like levels of restraint and seclusion have dropped significantly. The staff feel they understand people's mental health difficulties much better now. The staff morale is much better. The framework has helped us to understand our patients' individuals and address what's behind the diagnosis. They feel more compassionate towards service users. They feel like they're seeing the bigger picture, as we did with Matt. I think you can have these slides if you want to look at them in more detail. And just as important, if not more important, that the patients also agreed that their approach has been very helpful to them. So there's a lot more to this particular project than the framework, and they're in the process of writing some of it up. So, and it will appear on the Power Threat Meaning Framework website in due course. But anyway, the results have been positive enough that this approach is being rolled out across, I think it's 14 other wards in that part of London. And it doesn't mean that the medicalised approach has vanished. It certainly hasn't. It still looks and feels very much like a standard inpatient unit in lots of ways. And obviously, you're working within that setting. There are limitations in the system itself as to what you can change. Nevertheless, it seems like it's a very promising way forward. So that's some evidence for people looking for evidence of the framework. And oh dear, sorry, I missed out the very last slide, but anyway, you can see at the very last slide is the front cover of a book called A Straight Talking Introduction to the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which is coming out on the 12th of this month from PCCS Books. So if you Google Johnstone and Boyle, Power Threat Meaning Framework, PCCS Books, you will find it. It's a cheap, accessible version, and it's very practically orientated, and it would be useful, we hope, for people wanting to construct their own stories or to support other people to do it. Interesting. I live in Jordan. I think it could be very useful for the Middle Eastern countries if you could work on an Arabic version. I don't speak a word of Arabic, but I'd love to see it translated into as many languages as possible. Excellent. So we've got just a few minutes left for anyone to ask any further questions or make any comments. Same in Lebanon, you've got a lot of students from all over the world, haven't you? Mental health is stigmatized everywhere. It does. And actually, one of the things that we would like to see from a framework point of view is, instead of using this word mental health, but it's often difficult to find substitutes, actually we need to be thinking these are ordinary human feelings. There isn't a special set of feelings that are called mental health problems. There are ordinary human feelings, sometimes very extreme ones, sometimes very distressing ones, sometimes overwhelming ones, but in the end, ordinary, understandable human responses to difficult situations. Oh, great. Well done, Rachel. That's the book. And if you look on the PCCS website, Mary is going to do a brief, there's going to be a couple of seminars about this book coming up. So I'll send some links around so that you can join in and watch if you want to. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. Looks like people have enjoyed that brief tour, which is great. Thank you. Oh, Rachel's putting up another book. Users and Abusers of Psychiatry. It's a bit ancient now.
But still very, very relevant. So really recommend that one as well.
Thank you. Great. Well, I'd like to thank Kim for helping us to do this with minimal technical hitches, virtually done, and Jason and Rachel for inviting me. And maybe the four of us could stay online for a little bit just to have a brief chat, but perhaps that's all. Perhaps it's time to let the students go. What do you think, Jason?
Yeah, I just wanted to say a very big thank you, Lucy, for giving us a couple of hours of your time and for leading us through the framework in the way that you did. I think it made it very understandable, and the example that was used was fantastic, particularly to see a success in terms of somebody navigating their way out of mental health services rather than being trapped within them. So thank you ever so much for your time. And it's been really great having you with us. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.